Well, thank you, Ike, and my thanks as well to the entire staff of the Santa Barbara Museum of Art for bringing me here to participate in today's symposium. Picasso and Braque, the Cubist Experiment, is a smart and really sharply focused exhibition, and so it's both a pleasure and an honor to be here speaking to you this morning. For better or worse, in the remarks that follow, I won't be offering a new interpretation of Cubism. Instead, I'll be rehearsing some of the existing ones, though those that have been the most influential and that, in my view, are the most helpful in coming to grips with Cubism. I'll try to explain as best I can what I see as the strengths and shortcomings of each, as well as where they conflict with one another, and perhaps even more importantly, where they're in accord. My hope is that a discussion of this sort will help to provide a richer context both for the talks to come and for the paintings and prints in the galleries in the exhibition itself. So as soon as I take a drink of water, we'll begin. We've had 100 years now, almost to the day in the case of Picasso's glass of absinthe here, to come to terms with analytic cubism, to make sense of its fragmented forms and shallow, intermittent spatiality, its dense value gradations and heavily worked surfaces. Picasso himself offered relatively little explanation of his project, and Braque was no better. Presumably they talked to one another, even daily and at considerable length, but neither ever penned a manifesto of the movement, say, or offered interviews elaborating their intentions, at least not until long after the fact. In that regard, they were virtually unique among early 20th century artists whose paintings normally were accompanied by some written explanation, instructions to the uninitiated. In the case of Cubism, however, interpretation was left to others, other artists or critics, who felt the need for an account of this painting that looked so radically different from everything preceding it. The first serious attempts at explanation tended to fall into two opposing camps, or as Christine Poggi has argued, more commonly into both at once. On the one hand were claims for the painting's heightened realism, their ability, that is, to offer multiple views of a single object. So in the case of our glass of absinthe here, the circle, let me see, I've got to step out. Here is a circle there, but also the lower circle in particular was seen as the round base of the glass, so the glass in plan, as it were, with the vertical lines above denoting its stem and body in elevation. Whether this was interpreted as suggesting the painter's movement around the object or the result of that object's conceptual rather than merely perceptual apprehension, the implication was that Cubism had overcome painting's traditional restrictions to a single vantage point, and so could now provide a fuller account of our relation to things, a more complete grasp of them in their totality. On the other hand, there was the widespread assertion that Cubist paintings were themselves totalities, autonomous things in their own right, real, if you will, because no longer tied to illusionism, to mimetic description of the natural world. Carl Einstein, in his notes on Cubism, perhaps articulated this position best. The totalization of the painting comes about, he said, as a consequence of its unverifiability and the fact that the spectator never exits from the reality of the picture. The claim was that in contemplation of a work such as our glass of absinthe here, the viewer cuts him or herself off from the external world, which consequently recedes in memory. That world then ceases to be the yardstick against which the painting is measured. Again, these two views, on the one hand, that Cubist pictures give us a better or truer depiction of things as they actually are, on the other, that they are themselves independent or autonomous things, these would seem to be inherently contradictory. The first emphasizes the representational function of the image, the second all but denies it. Of course, that didn't prevent both views from being voiced by one and the same individual, often in the space of a single essay. But rather than seeing this as a flaw of the criticism, I want to suggest, and here again I'm following Chris Poggi's lead, that the contradictions inherent in the early interpretations of Cubism actually reveal something very important about the works in question. Cubism was an art built out of and sustained by contradiction. And the best accounts we have of it are precisely those that emphasize the things most contradictory in its aims and ambitions. As far as I know, the first person to explicitly acknowledge the contradictions of Cubism and to offer a compelling account of its development based on their interplay was the critic Clement Greenberg. In his 1959 essay, Collage, Greenberg articulated the dilemma he saw confronting Picasso and Braque over the course of their shared enterprise. On the one hand, he said, every Cubist work, in contradistinction to centuries of Western paintings preceding it, had to spell out, rather than pretend to deny, the physical fact that it was flat, that it was, we might interject, a real tangible object, even though at the same time it had to overcome this proclaimed flatness as an aesthetic fact, these are Greenberg's exact words, and continue to report nature. We should take note of that rather peculiar phrase in the last line, aesthetic fact. It too has a hint of the contradictory or oxymoronic about it. Plainly enough, in using it, Greenberg wanted to give the painting's aesthetic qualities a weight comparable to that of its physical, literal, or factual existence. It's not enough for the Cubist work to be flat. A blank canvas, an ironing board, a piece of wallpaper for that matter, are all flat. To be a painting, the Cubist work will have to confess its flatness, but also somehow overcome or negate it. Greenberg's concerns at the beginning of his text are with Picasso's and Braque's paintings from 1910, that is to say, with the works that also open our exhibition. I'm showing you as an example Braque's Woman with a Mandolin, a painting included in the show. According to Greenberg, works such as this took the particular form they did as a result of an effort to find a balance between, on the one hand, flattened facet planes that would echo and therefore emphasize the two-dimensionality and rectilinearity of the canvas. So these little planes that seem everywhere to kind of heave into relief. And on the other, a modeling that could potentially disrupt our awareness of the surface. Nothing more than that, however, were the modeling to function successfully, that is, to create a plausible illusion of solid volumetric form, the painting would have to be deemed in denial of its physical flatness, masquerading as sculpture then, rather than owning up to be the painting that it actually is. Greenberg's terminology is nicely counterintuitive here. The main problem at this juncture, he said, became to keep the inside of the picture, its content, from fusing with the outside, its literal surface. If Greenberg designates the surface of the canvas as outside, it's kind of counterintuitive, and the work's representational content within, it's presumably to emphasize that for Picasso and Braque, representation remained the proper purview of painting. Conversely, a work that abandoned that function would become simply an object and so fall outside the domain of painting, or the domain of art at large. At the same time, of course, Greenberg wants to call our attention to the way that inside and outside are coming into increasingly close proximity here. And so he refers not to the painting's illusionistic depth, but rather its depicted flatness. Okay? He says, for example, and I quote, "Depicted flatness, that is the facet planes, had to be kept separate enough from literal flatness to permit a minimal illusion of three-dimensional space to survive between the two." Braque had earlier tried to address the problem by means of trompe-l'oeil. For example, in his still life with violin and pitcher here, he painted a tack at the top of the canvas, here, which casts a highly illusionistic shadow below. By effectively conflating the wall, that is the rearmost of the painting's depicted planes, and the physical plane of the canvas itself, Braque was able to suggest a space forward or on top of the picture's rendered flatness between the depicted planes and the space in which we stand. But such devices, Greenberg says, were mere expedients, more gimmick than actual solution to the problem at hand. Still, they did bring Picasso and Braque to a crucial realization, namely that there might be a way to overcome literal or physical flatness by paradoxically bringing it to the fore. It's worth quoting Greenberg here at some length. Before I do that, I'm going to take another sip of water, if you don't mind. If the actuality of the surface, he says, its real physical flatness, could be indicated explicitly enough in certain places, it would be distinguished and separated from everything else the surface contained. Once the literal nature of the support was advertised, whatever upon it was not intended literally would be set off and enhanced in its non-literalness. Or to put it still another way, depicted flatness would inhabit at least the semblance of a three-dimensional space, as long as the brute undepicted flatness of the literal surface was pointed to as being still flatter, end quote. Hence the printed or stenciled letters and numbers that in 1911, first Braque and then Picasso began introducing into their compositions. The point was to draw attention through those inscriptions to the literal surface of the painting. So we see that they reside right there on the surface, so that everything less obviously adhering to it would appear to recede in depth as a result of the comparison. The only problem, Greenberg says, was that familiarity seemed to weaken the effect. By 1912, Picasso and Braque had begun selectively adding sand to their paint so as to give it a visible texture. And that's the case with Braque's clarinet here. Unfortunately, the sand rarely shows up in photographic reproductions. It's much more evident in person. And you can see a sort of minor example of it in the exhibition in Braque's Still Life with Banderillas. But it is there. You'll trust me, I hope, in various places throughout. The hope was that by giving it a visible texture, still larger areas of the actual surface could be emphasized, thereby prolonging the desired spatial illusions everywhere else. Okay? As Greenberg tells the story, this strategy too eventually proved insufficient, and of course, it was bound to, insofar as the intention was to overcome and not merely to deny the literal flatness of the painting's material support. The project was doomed from failure from the start. Ontological failure, I hasten to add, not aesthetic failure. On aesthetic grounds, I think we can agree the works managed quite nicely. Yet it was their non-reconciliation to flatness, to, we might say, the unavoidable conditions of their own existence, that most characterized Cubism in Greenberg's account. It's also what drove its development. Faced with the impossible demand to simultaneously spell out and overcome its literal flatness, Cubist painting was driven to ever more extreme measures. Its history appears, as a result, as a succession of retrospective dialectical responses to its inability to free itself from its all too literal material support. In the end, as Greenberg tells it, the accumulation of stenciling and textures threatened to overwhelm and thereby collapse the distinction between depicted and undepicted flatnesses that it had been the explicit purpose of those devices to produce. But it was just at this point, and presumably as a direct result of those earlier failures, that Picasso and Braque hit on the idea of collage, or more specifically papier-collé. That's what I'm showing you here. That is, works created entirely out of pasted papers, and sometimes then drawn upon as well. To be sure, the new ploy raised the stakes considerably. The pieces of paper that were affixed quite tangibly to the surface declared that surface with an unprecedented literalness. The risk was even greater now that undepicted flatness, literal flatness, would become the main event of the picture, effectively subsuming any and all implications of depth. The brilliance of the new medium, according to Greenberg, was that within the narrowing confines of an opposition between literal surface and illusionistic depth, and at the very moment when literal surface seemed on the brink of becoming the only term, papier-collé delivered a solution in which illusionism was transformed but thereby preserved. Again, I think it's worth quoting Greenberg at some length on these matters, particularly as he sees them playing out in this specific work. He says, and I quote, "In the upper center of Braque's first collage, Fruit Dish, a bunch of grapes is rendered with such conventionally vivid sculptural effects, or at least effects sufficiently sculptural, as to lift it practically off the picture plane. The trompe-l'oeil illusion here is no longer enclosed within parallel flatnesses, but seems to thrust through the surface of the drawing paper and establish depth on top of it. Yet the violent immediacy of the wallpaper strips pasted to the paper and the only lesser immediacy of the block capitals that simulate window lettering manage somehow to push the grape cluster back into place on the picture plane so that it doesn't jump. At the same time, the wallpaper strips themselves seem to be pushed into depth by the lines and patches of shading charcoaled upon them and by their placing in relation to the block capitals. And these capitals seem in turn to be pushed back by their placing and by contrast with the corporeality of the wood graining. Thus, every part and plane of the picture keeps changing place in relative depth with every other part and plane. And it's as if the only stable relation left among the different parts of the picture is the ambivalent and ambiguous one that each has with the surface." End quote. Greenberg's language in this passage is compelling, and we're meant, I think, to sense a major turning point in his narrative. In fact, over the course of the next several pages of his text, he goes on to claim that the papier-collé managed to achieve at last what the earlier works had not, namely an overcoming of the opposition between literal and depicted flatnesses that until that moment had been presented as the insurmountable tension driving the development of Cubist painting. The key to the reconciliation, according to Greenberg, was papier-collé's inherent potential for illusion. In the pasted paper works, he conceded, "Flatness may monopolize everything," but here I'm quoting again. "It's a flatness becomes so ambiguous and expanded as to turn into illusion itself." Mind you, the illusionism at issue is no longer pictorial, achieved through perspective and sculptural modeling, as in the works of the past. Rather, it's an optical illusionism, arising within formal configurations that openly declare their two-dimensionality, an illusionism capable of displacing surfaces so that they seem to hover in an imaginary and decidedly non-physical space. In the later papier-collé, according to Greenberg, the last vestiges of sculptural shading that still clung to Braque's Fruit Dish here would be eliminated, thereby demonstrating that optical illusion could be produced without the aid of any pictorial illusion whatsoever, that the physical surface could be displaced and recreated out of shapes that were wholly and unimpeachably flat. Now, there are problems with this account of Cubism, to be sure, including the fact that neither Picasso nor Braque ever did actually produce papier-collé devoid of all sculptural modeling. That's why I haven't shown you a slide of one of those. Still, it seems to me that Greenberg's larger narrative, especially the part concerning the paintings of 1911 and 1912, is able to accommodate many of the eccentric features of the works, their stenciling, for example, and the addition of sand to their surfaces, that demand explanation, yet that prior to Greenberg's essay at least, had seemed particularly inexplicable. My own sense, as you've undoubtedly surmised, given the time I've devoted to it, is that Greenberg's account has at least a certain explanatory power, and therefore deserves rather more attention than it's received, at least over the last several decades. The essay's disregard or disfavor during that period is plainly the result of a kind of collective dissatisfaction over what we might call its optical dénouement. Unhappy with the story's conclusion, scholars have tended to overlook or discount even its more promising beginnings. Certainly, one way to understand the several semiotic interpretations of Cubism that appeared in the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s, notably those by Rosalind Krauss and Yves Lambois, is as reactions to Greenberg's opticality And I should add his tendency to measure all modern painting against that single standard. Precisely at the moment where Greenberg saw the triumph of optical illusion in Picasso's and Braque's papier-collé. I show you now Picasso's violin from 1912. Krauss and Bois would see instead Cubism's engagement with quasi-linguistic signs. Indeed, the very turn to papier-collé is to be understood in Krauss's and Bois' view as driven by a desire to develop, if not for painting per se, at least for picturing, discrete signifying units analogous to the words or phonemes of written and spoken language. Each shard of paper in the violin here is to be seen as just such a unit, neatly delimited, in contrast to the generally seamless continuity of an oil painting surface. Is that a laugh from the conservators? No. Note, too, that it's not simply a matter of any paper. These are shards of newspaper, the printed text insinuating that an analogous process of signification operates within the collage. It seems to be significant that for both Bois and Krauss, Cubism's experiments with papier-collé were being conducted more or less concurrently with major developments in structural linguistics, notably those of Roman Jakobson and Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure's course in general linguistics, which was offered 3 times at the University of Geneva between 1907 and 1911, before its publication as a book in 1916, emphasized that language constituted at any particular moment a formal system, the elements of which drew their meaning only oppositionally, that is, as a result of their differences from one another. Language was not, then, the simple naming process it was normally taken to be, not a matter of a simple one-to-one correlation between the word and the Latin words arbor and equus, for example, and the things in the world, that is, the tree or the horse standing over there in the field. In actuality, things are more complicated than that. In his course, Saussure distinguished first between the concept, here designated as arbor, and the written or spoken word, tree, and then between the concept and its referent in the real world. He also underscored the fact that different languages cut things up differently. That's the point of the third diagram there in the upper right. A is the seamless continuity of possible concepts. B, the field of signifiers or sounds that might potentially be used to designate them. Again, different languages divide things up differently. English, Saussure pointed out, has 2 separate words, sheep and mutton, for the living and cooked versions of the animal, whereas the French has only one, mouton. The other example everyone always trots out, though I have no idea whether or not it's true, is that the Eskimos have 7 different signifiers for everything encompassed by our one word, snow. These linguistic differences occur because the relation between signifier and signified is wholly arbitrary, which is to say that the word tree, in either its written or its spoken versions, in no way resembles the maple standing out there on the lawn. Images, of course, are typically not of this order. They signify something precisely by resembling it. But one of the upshots of this is that images, no less than words, are often taken to have a one-to-one correspondence, like names, with the things that they denote. Patently enough, even Saussure, when he wanted to refer to a real tree, right, rather than its linguistic signifier, used an image of a tree. Okay. The metaphor of the painting as window, ubiquitous throughout the Western mimetic tradition, has similarly encouraged viewers' tendency to regard images as more or less transparent to the things that they denote. But is painting's rootedness in likeness a given? Might it be possible for painting to develop and make use of essentially arbitrary signs, signs that, like words, would be capable of referring to things in the world, but in the absence of illusionism, perhaps even foregoing resemblance altogether? That's the question explicitly raised, according to Krauss and Bois, by Picasso's violin here and other papier-collé. From one work to the next, Picasso often reused nearly identical shapes but had them signify different things in their different contexts. You can probably see that a shape like this here could easily serve in another collage were it repositioned slightly rightward, not as the notched silhouette of a violin, but rather as the front face and sound hole of a guitar. In that case, we'd want to say that the pieces in their separate contexts function like homonyms, like words that sound alike but have distinctly different meanings. Traditionally, painting and other works of visual art don't function that way. Mimetic resemblance precludes that sort of multiple signification. Indeed, our violin here may represent the limit case in Cubism's effort to create an arbitrary visual sign. As Krauss has pointed out, the two paper fragments employed here evidently once belonged to the same sheet of newspaper. We're able to rejoin them in our imagination along the contour of this jigsaw puzzle-like edge. Having scissored them apart, Picasso simply turned the one over before pasting them both down on the surface. Again, the leftmost piece designates in the context of this collage the surface and silhouette of a violin. But what about the rightmost fragment? Krauss argues, convincingly to my mind, that we're meant to see its parallel lines of type as more or less continuous with the hatchings below. And I think the effect would have been even stronger before the newspaper yellowed. And therefore as signifying the shadowy space alongside the instrument. We have then two signifiers, materially indistinguishable in that they once belonged to the very same sheet of newspaper, but that in the context of this single work have been made to signify not just different things, but opposites, things that are nearly antithetical to one another. On the one hand, flat, opaque surface, and on the other, shadowy atmospheric depth. Krauss presented her reading of Picasso's violin at a 1989 symposium held in conjunction with the Museum of Modern Art's blockbuster exhibition, Picasso and Braque, Pioneering Cubism. As his contribution to that same symposium, Yves Lambois provided a historical account of Cubism from roughly 1908 to 1912, which also drew heavily on semiotics. I should add that the more or less simultaneous presentation of these two papers contributed to the impression at the time that the semiotic angle was fast becoming the reigning orthodoxy among interpreters of Cubism. For his part, Bois wanted to show that from the outset, Cubism had been working toward the development of a system of fully arbitrary signs, the discrete signifying units of papier-collé being but the culmination of that effort. What Bois designated the first phase of Cubism, represented by Picasso's three women here, was characterized, he said, by the repeated subdividing of the painting's surface. The figures or other represented elements of the work emerging as a byproduct of that division. In the case of the three women, Bois argued, the field has been carved up into triangular segments, as a result of which particular anatomical features are generated. That it's a matter of dividing a single continuous surface is underscored not only by those places, such as here up by the elbow, I think, where the figures still seem attached to their background, but also by a contour such as this one here, which serves simultaneously to delineate the breast and torso of the rightmost woman, as well as the buttocks and thigh of her sister alongside. In what Bois calls Cubism's second semiological phase, the units became rectangular, and in certain cases, such as that of our still life with liqueur bottle here, Picasso deliberately chose objects particularly well suited to the new geometric paradigm. And that is, the cut glass bottle of liqueur was in some sense already cubist. Over the course of the next 10 or 12 months, the rectangular units of these cubist paintings increasingly took on the overall form of a grid. As a result, they took on, too, a kind of double signification, Bois says, simultaneously referring to the figure represented, however elusively, and to the rectangular shape of the canvas itself, which the grid effectively replicated in miniature. At this point, according to Bois, following the summer that Picasso and Braque spent together in Spain in the town of Cadaqués, Cubism arrived at a crossroads. It could abandon representation altogether, stop figuring the world outside of the work, or somehow devise a means of signification that would allow painting to retain its representational function, but without having to return to the illusionism of the past. Clearly, both Picasso and Braque felt that were painting to renounce its traditional representational function, there would be neither any rules governing its production nor criteria by which to measure its success. Any decisions regarding the placement of this line or that color could only ever be arbitrary, but now in the sense of entirely random. Okay? And so Picasso and Braque didn't go that direction. They clung to representation. It's at this point that Picasso and Braque both began introducing into their paintings small pictographic elements. In the case of Picasso's portrait of Kahnweiler here, the lines denoting, get my laser pointer working, sort of mustache, hair, watch chain, hands. These signs, if you will, are still iconic, which is to say they're still able to represent something, a watch chain, for example, by resembling it. But they're doing so now in the conspicuous absence of sculptural modeling or any other form of real illusionism. Bois designates this as Cubism's hieroglyphic stage, precisely because, like hieroglyphs, the pictographic elements of these paintings seem to inhabit the territory in between illusionistic images and the arbitrary signs of writing. I've already indicated that Bois, like Krauss, regards the papier-collé of the following year as different in kind, and that they fully inhabit the territory of the arbitrary sign. However, Bois sees Picasso's still life with chair caning here, a work of collage that preceded the papier-collé. Indeed, it's the very first collage ever produced, as importantly transitional in this whole process. As Rosalind Krauss first noted, the still life with chair caning makes itself available to two contradictory readings. On the one hand, we can regard it as a more or less traditional still life, a painting of so many objects, a glass here, a newspaper, le journal, a pipe here, a slice of tart or quiche, arrayed on a table at some distance from us. Our line of gaze at those objects being then essentially perpendicular to our upright bodies. But it's also possible to see the painting otherwise. That is, we might instead choose to regard the rope-encircled oval-shaped canvas as referring to the top of the table, perhaps a glass table even, with a collaged piece of caning imprinted fabric then suggesting the edge of the chair pushed underneath. In that case, we would not be looking out at the still life objects, but rather down at them, our line of sight now running more or less parallel to our upright bodies. Christine Poggi has, I think, nicely described the collage as offering itself as both table and tableau, that latter term implying precisely the vertical orientation of the work historically associated with easel painting. Bois, for his part, though, describes still life with chair caning as marking, quote, the moment when something is about to topple. For in the collapse of the vertical and the horizontal, what Picasso is inscribing is the very possibility of the transformation of painting into writing, of the empirical and vertical space of vision controlled by our own erect position on the ground into the semiological horizontal space of reading, end quote. Again, it's that horizontal space of reading and writing that Bois sees the papier-collé as fully inhabiting. Now, the last of the art historical accounts of Cubism that I want to discuss this morning, though I've hardly left time to do it justice, is the one given by T.J. Clarke in Cubism and Collectivity, an essay that appeared in his 1999 book, Farewell to an Idea. Almost from the outset, Clarke is concerned to separate his account from those that have preceded it, and it's clear from the footnotes, at least, that he has both Bois and Greenberg's essays fairly firmly in mind. In contrast to theirs, Clarke says, a certain disconnected quality seems necessary to his own narrative, precisely because, here I'm quoting, it's the opposite quality that I most distrust in the accounts that we already have. That is, the way they are driven by a basic commitment to narrative continuity, by a wish to see Picasso's work from 1907 to 1912 as possessing a logic or forming a sequence, as not being broken or interrupted in any important way, not, above all, encountering failure. If Cubist works are historical at all, he adds, it's only insofar as they constantly seem to be moving towards some declaration of epic-making failure, painting at the end of its tether, so to say, or in an ether where its means are hopelessly clouded or more and more impalpable. Clarke actually agrees with Braque that in Cubism the signs are becoming increasingly arbitrary. But he insists that the works themselves only grudgingly accept that arbitrariness, and always either in a dark or a sardonic mode. The freer and freer player of the signifier is represented, he says, at the same time as it's embraced as a mereness, a mechanizing or automatism of mark-making, an overallness which registers as the opposite of liberty or even autonomy. Clarke's basic claim is that Cubism never achieved the status of a language, though it pretended to have done so. It was, he suggests, essentially the counterfeit of such a language, though I should add he holds that fact to be precisely what makes a painting such as our man with a pipe here the brilliant, quintessentially modern work that it is. As Clarke tells the story, in the summer of 1910, the one spent at Catalogue, where Picasso's work in particular became as arbitrary or abstract as it ever would, where the paintings, such as the rower here, perched on the edge of a wholly unverifiable relation to the things they purportedly describe. The artist came face to face with the disenchantment of the world, which meant in Picasso's case, Clarke says, and I quote, the disenchantment of painting, the revealing of more and deeper structures of depiction as purely contingent, nothing but devices. The little hieroglyphic signs that began appearing in the paintings made the following fall. I'll go back now to our man with a pipe. All those preposterous mustaches, cleft chins, and beady little eyes, Clarke says, show us quite explicitly what the pursuit of likeness looks like, here I'm quoting directly, in a situation where all versions of such a pursuit have proved impossible to sustain. Now, for all his desire to separate himself from the so-called semioticians, Clarke's position here looks, at least from my vantage point, not so very different from that of Rosalind Krauss. In her essay, The Motivation of the Sign, Krauss had presented Picasso turning to quasi-linguistic signifiers as a kind of last resort, a way of writing depth on a field from which its illusionistic invocation had been effectively banished. It's extremely important to note that the only wholly arbitrary signifiers in her account are precisely those that signify depth, or the related notions of obliquity and luminosity. Krauss is very clear on this point. She says, and I quote, this matter of motivating the sign raised by my title, and remember her title was The Motivation of the Sign, does not then refer to the import of the semiological term heralded by collage. Rather, it addresses the specific sets of signifieds that Picasso seems most insistently to organize in the opening years of his exploration of collage. Those signifieds, depth and atmosphere or light, are in no way random, but are prepared for, motivated, if you will, by the experience of the preceding 5 years. She means, by the way, that three-dimensionality had been progressively drained from each successive picture. So, for example, when Krauss points to the two mismatched F holes in the violin here, and suggests that they are arbitrary signs, it's not that they are arbitrary signs for F holes. If they signify those holes, it's because they resemble them, however much the kind of typographic quality of the rendering insinuates some connection to language. The mismatched F-holes remain then iconic signs insofar as they refer to those particular features of the violin. But in their disparity, that is in the mismatching that's designed here to suggest the violin's oblique turning, that's when they become fully arbitrary signs, but now signs for depth. Together, the F-holes signify space or depth even as they assert its absence, its literal absence, even as they can't or won't conjure it illusionistically for the composition. In Krauss's account, Cubism's progressive flattening, and so also its recourse to this form of signification, is accompanied by a profound sense of loss. She would have us see that a distinct melancholy air pervades works such as Picasso's Girl with a Mandolin, a melancholy made all the more poignant by those few places, I think most notably here in the area of the arm, where the machinery of illusionism is not misfiring, and so is able yet to conjure, miraculously, a palpably believable, tangibly present form. Again, and here I'm about to conclude, in these comments by Krauss, we're not very far, it seems to me, from the dark mood that Clarke sees coloring Cubism, particularly in those years from 1910 to 1912 that are the focus of our exhibition. In fact, I'd argue we're not on ground so very different either from that covered by Clement Greenberg in his essay on collage, at least before collage took its turn toward a triumphant opticality. In all three cases, it's a matter of a kind of negative dialectic within Cubism. The work's increasingly forced into a position of grudgingly acknowledging that which they most fear or revile. Clarke calls it an abstract unverifiability. In Greenberg's account, it's mere flatness. In Krauss's, a two-dimensionality devoid of any carnal connection to the world. But in all three accounts, the works manage in such a way that both the acknowledgement and the antipathy are on view. The work's achievement, triumph, we might even say, resides precisely in their ability to make both things simultaneously apparent. Admission alone would amount to mere acceptance, resulting in something that was simply, flatly decorative and detached from any engagement with the world. Whereas antipathy on its own would be tantamount to a denial of how much painting and the world around it had changed in the first decade and a half of the 20th century. It is finally this doubleness, I would argue, the work's acknowledgement of loss and their stubborn, if ineffectual, resistance to it, that makes them not just the haunting images they are, but also so wholly exemplary of modernity. Thank you.